Welcome to the Contagious Code Podcast, where we dive deep into code, learn practical skills, celebrate the beauty of engineering, and eliminate imposter syndrome. I'm Tejas Kumar, and I've been building on the web for over 20 years at places like Vercel, Spotify, Zeta, and more. Today, my guest is Erik Rasmussen. Erik Rasmussen has started and built his career on open source as the author of a library called Redux Form and React Final Form. In our discussion today, we talk about all of that in detail. We talk about being active in open source, developing a career from open source, and the complexity around building open source projects that are used by a large number of people. Indeed, Redux Form and React Final Form are used by a large number of people. So if you've ever been interested in what it takes to build and maintain a large open source project in the Redux or React ecosystem, this episode is for you. Particularly, we talk about navigating work-life balance and burnout. Oftentimes, when you receive a bunch of issues on GitHub, for your open source project, you tend to be overwhelmed and you don't know if now's a good time or not. And so you kind of feel like everything's rushed. We go into the details about how to manage open source projects well in that way. We also talk about Solid.js as a sort of next step to React and adding interoperability for libraries like Redux and React Final Form. Solid.js is like React syntactically, except the key difference is the way Solid.js manages state. Solid.js uses fine-grained reactivity through observables, sometimes called signals. This way, when you update state in Solid, only the small piece of the application that changes. The function that represents that piece of the application is called. Conversely, with React, the thing that changed its function is called, and all of the children indiscriminately, right? So it's coarser in terms of reactivity. So we go into depth about Solid.js. Also, Erik is a user of state machines and a fan of Stately, a partner of the podcast. And we talk about using state machines on the server side to model complex application logic. So if you're interested in open source projects, form libraries, React, Redux at scale, and more, this episode is for you. Now, I'd like to offer this to all of you at no cost. However, this is separate to my day job and there are a bunch of costs involved. So let's take a moment to thank the partners and sponsors that make this possible. The Contagious Code podcast is partnered with Code Crafters. Code Crafters has a way of teaching you how to get better at code, similar to me. My most popular talk ever was a talk called Deconstructing React, where we built a React app, but we didn't import React. Instead, we polyfilled React. We literally wrote it as we went until we had something working. Code Crafters teaches you how things like Git and Redis and Docker, tools we use every day, work by having you re-implement them from scratch in a language that you know, like JavaScript or Python. In so doing, you get better at your language, that is JavaScript or Python, and you also develop a deeper understanding of these tools because you build them from scratch, so you understand better how they're built. They have a generous free tier, but if you'd like to pay, you can get up to 40% off using the link in the show notes. That's tej.as/codecrafters. The Contagious Code podcast is also partnered with Stately.ai. Stately is a great way to visualize how state works across your application through state machines and state charts, as well as the transitions between those states. Once you have a machine that represents your application, you can export it to JSON and fill in the logic that triggers transitions. Therefore, most of your application is covered, robust, and ready and testable, most importantly. Stately also has a framework called Agent that helps you build AI-enabled autonomous agents with guardrails. If you'd like to give any of this a try, go to stately.ai. Finally, That Conference Wisconsin is about to happen, and the Contagious Code podcast is partnered with That Conference, a family-style, multidisciplinary conference. If you'd like to attend it for free, we have a raffle where we give away free tickets. We have 5 free tickets to give away, so if you'd like to attend this, share this episode on social media, say you'd like to enter the raffle, and you will. Hey, thanks for sticking around for the partners and sponsors. Now for my discussion with Erik Rasmussen. Erik Rasmussen. Dude, it's an honor to have you on the podcast. We spent so much time at conferences across the world. It's so nice to be able to sit down with you and have a chat in detail.
Yes, same here. It's good to see you again.
I think you're best known for talks at conferences. I mean, you're best also known for your work at Mavenoid and so on. But I think one of the things I remember, my earliest memory of you is where we met in person in Sydney at a conference called Web Directions. And you gave me a sticker, which was like a checkered flag from like races. And this is for your library, React Final Form. Can we talk about that? Maybe we can start with just a broad intro to yourself and what you're famous for, and then get to the library as well.
I just want to give you some credit too, because you took that sticker and you put it on your chest, and you gave a talk with my library's logo on your chest. So
yeah, why not?
That was cool.
Yeah, so let's maybe start with it. I apologize. I didn't take the time to actually offer you an intro. So let's maybe introduce yourself and then the library.
Yes. Okay. So I'm Eric. I am originally American, but I've been an expat in Spain now for almost 20 years. Uh, and I, in the JavaScript community, I'm known for being the author of two form libraries, Redux Form and Final Form / React Final Form. Uh, and it was through that open source work that I got invited to talk at a conference, uh, and ever since then I have enjoyed doing that several times a year, and I get to
Okay,
meet people like our host here.
that's so cool. So it's there's so many things I want to ask you about there because what you just said, so I understand correctly, is you just did some open source work and then got invited to speak at a conference. That I feel like is a story.
Yeah, well, okay, so I was just plugging along, addressing issues and pull requests and stuff in Redux form, and then I got a mention on Twitter where somebody was like, "Hey, I bet this guy would be a good guy to come talk at our conference," and and I DM'd them back and I was like, "I'm sorry, you seem to have mistaken me for a public speaker. I've never done anything like this. I just sit here in the dark and code." And they were like, "Well, we would fly you out to Bangalore, India, and put you up in the Ritz Carlton if you wanted to come." And I was like, "Okay, I guess I can talk about this thing that I'm passionate about for 50 minutes."
50 minutes.
50 minutes was my first talk,
Oh my
and
gosh.
it was at the end of the second day of this conference. Uh, and as you may know, in India they use the word keynote to mean any sort of talk, not
Hmm.
the important one at the beginning. So they kept saying, "Oh, we're gonna come to this keynote," and so I was like, "I don't know if I want to." And they were like, "Well, why don't you reach out to this guy that was here last year, Kyle Simpson,
Oh wow,
who
guest on the
you've
podcast.
you've had as a guest on the podcast." And I DM'd him. He didn't know me from Adam, and I didn't really know who he was because I generally am not a book purchaser. Uh, and I was
Thanks.
like, "Hey, how's this?" And he was like, "You should go do it for sure." Anyway, he gave me some encouragement. And the other bit of encouragement I had to get into public speaking was someone told me, "Have you seen any tech talks? Like, the level of public speaking is not, the bar is not that high. You can probably get there. I mean, not everyone's a Tejas, but so it was." And then I found that I loved it. I met some of the other speakers there that were super important people in the community, uh, and just traveling the world. It's cool.
Wow. I had no idea. Like we've spent so much time at conferences. I never heard that. And this is why I love this podcast. I learn
Right.
things about friends. So you just were this guy writing code, writing a form library, and you got
Right.
mentioned. This is so different than how most other people like end up speaking at this is very different than how I ended up speaking at conferences, right? And that's maybe a discussion for another time, but that's wild. Okay, so you just made, was it Redux form or Final form at the time?
Redux form.
And somebody used it and they added you on Twitter, and wow, this is a testament for people listening about the reach and power of open source. That is so cool. Would you recommend that path for others? Would you say this is one of the most accessible ways to sort of make it to the conference circuit? Start with open source, solve your own problem, and then you may get in.
It's a way. Uh, I often get the question of, "Hey, I've written an open source library. How do I get people to use it?" Uh, and that is just one of those ineffable things that you can't really put a like. There's no solution to that really. I mean, you can tweet about it until you're blue in the face, but
Yeah.
unless you're solving a problem that other people have, and it's if you're in the right place at the right time, like Redux form came out right when, first of all, people realized that React didn't really have a way to maintain form state,
Yeah.
uh, and it was also when Redux was the new hotness that like, oh my god, we have to move everything into Redux. And so I don't know, I just did that at the time, and it was immediately obvious how quickly how many other people were having that same exact problem, because lots of people found it and were suggesting things and asking for features and whatnot.
Right.
So
Right.
yes, sure. I guess that's one way to get into the conference circuit. Probably a better way is just to shotgun out 1,000 CFPs and see if you get a nibble.
Yeah, we actually have an episode on CFPs with Daniel Afonso, who's on the program committee for so many conferences, and he's on the program committee, so he has a lot of tips there. Okay, that's really interesting. So you mentioned a really interesting thing about open source work, which is there's open source work, which is like I use this library, so I found an issue, I'm going to go fix it. For example, and this is
Right.
not to pick on Next.js, but Next.js maybe has some performance issues around the Turbo dev server. And so you go like, oh, I wonder if I can help, and then you clone the repo and you fix it. You open a pull request. This is like standard open source, but sometimes people create novel things like libraries for forms, and have this mindset. And I've certainly been there, right? Like I make an open source repo, and I'm like, I want people to use it. And why do I want? Like, where does that come from? That's such a strange problem because maybe people don't have the problem. Maybe people don't want to use it. I find that thought process really interesting. Like, why do we care so much about people using our stuff?
It's certainly not for the money. Maybe just, I mean, I'll be honest, it feels really good to see that your library has this many million downloads, and that, like, I know that that's the biggest companies in the world somewhere in their code base are using code that I've written, which
Wow.
is, it feels good. It doesn't,
Yeah.
like I said, it doesn't convert into anything real other than just good vibes. But
And maybe a reputation, right? I think it's very. For example, this podcast, like we do some
Potentially,
really
yeah.
deep dives, and companies reach out to me and they're like, oh, we can tell you know your stuff, and I was like, how? And they go like, well, you talk about it. Okay, so maybe it's that validation. I think that's what it is actually. So I've made libraries where I really want people to use it. It was some type of data fetching. This was before TanStack. I was TanStack before TanStack, and I really wanted people to use it because I wanted the validation that I know my stuff. And this is because I have a non-traditional background. I don't have a computer science degree. Is my work good enough that other people lean on it? I guess for me, that's the case. And I wonder
Right.
if that's probably it for most people.
How ironic that I used a form library to get validation.
Yes, Eric the dad. Let's maybe talk about the form libraries. Redux Form, Final Form. You mentioned Redux Form came out when Redux was the new hotness.
Yep.
Redux has evolved a lot since the day. Like today, it's RTK, Redux Toolkit. And then there's React Final Form. What's the difference? Is React Final Form, and I apologize, I've never used them. Personally, I've never felt the need for. I know,
How dare
it's-
you.
that, but that's why we're here. I've never felt the
Validate
need
me,
for.
Tejas.
Well, nowadays I just use Zod and TRPC. Anyway, but about the libraries, is React Final Form an evolution of Redux Form? Is it just moving away from Redux? Are people? I saw like things on Twitter about people saying GraphQL isn't relevant anymore, Redux isn't relevant anymore. So I'm curious if you could speak to all of that. Like, what's the distinction between them? Is Redux still maintained? I mean, the form library and so on.
Right. Okay. So with Redux, you've got just this common store for the whole front end, and you're just throwing actions at it, and it's updating state, and then you can select that state. And that's fine, except that it's global state, and literally any action you send is going to have to go through and check all of the reducers. Hey, do you care about this bit of state that just changed? And it's pretty performant, but when you're sending actions with every keystroke, that's a little faster.
Yeah.
And I remember before I even wrote it, I was on the Reactive Flux Slack. That was back when it was on Slack, and I asked Mr. Abramoff. I said, "Is Redux going to be fast enough for an action on every keystroke?" And he was like, probably try it. And a library was born. No, and so the Redux form had several issues. It was very tightly coupled to React, Redux, and at conferences, some people would come up to me and be like, "Hey, we're using Redux with Angular. Like, why can't we use your thing?" I was like, "It's too tightly coupled. I can't really help you there." And also that it's just this global store, but that also allowed you to like do stuff where some button in the corner could like affect your form data if you wanted it to, but that's bad design. And the big one was that because of the architecture, it could not be used with render props. And it had to be a higher order component. And this was right when render props was becoming the next new hotness. And it was, and everyone was like, "Why can't I use render props? Why can't I use render props?" And I got all this feedback. And so I said, all right, what if we like started from the ground up and built everything? Because over the course of maintaining Redux Form, I learned thousands of use cases, well, thousands is much, dozens of crazy use cases for forms that had never occurred to me. Like when I first wrote it,
Wow.
I thought I'm building a form with 15 fields. It's always going to have the 15 fields. I know at dev time what the 15 fields are. And then someone came along and I need a button to like add a new, hobby or whatever to my CV or whatever. And then I was like, well, we need to add not just one field, but like several fields, like as a group of like, shipping addresses or whatever. And all these different sort of use cases. And so with all of this knowledge, I started from the ground up to build Final Form that would handle all of these known use cases that I knew about. And my biggest epiphany was that form state is framework agnostic. It doesn't care what front end framework you're using. Like the form that our grandkids are going to be using with their VR headsets to sign up for Starfleet Academy is still going to need form validation, right? And you're going to have to go back and say, oh, actually this is required. So even beyond JavaScript, I mean, what form data is its own unique animal that doesn't care what the UI library is. So I built just the core to manage all of that with the other complaint I had was that too many re-renders,
Yeah.
That's like the story of React. Why is my thing re-rendering so much?
Yeah.
And so I specifically made Final Form so that you could subscribe to particular parts of your state, like a select statement in SQL or GraphQL, where you're just choosing the bits that you cared to re-render for, and when that changed, it would notify you, and you could re-render your component. And so those were the basics. And I built the core Final Form, and then because I'm a React developer, I built the React wrapper around it, and released it to the world 2 months after Formic came out. And Jared has told me that he would not have built Formic if I'd been a little bit faster in getting mine out, because he just wanted render props.
Right.
But I was just too late, and Formic took off, and I was always going to be, I would never to be number one framework again.
Yeah.
But it was, and like I always thought, this Final Form can and should be used with other frameworks, and sure enough, over time, other people built like a Vue thing and a web components thing around it, and I got a lot of nice validation for my idea when hooks came out, and I had to rewrite React Final Form to use hooks, and it was just so easy. Like it didn't require anything. Already, my subscription thing was a thing that returned the unsubscribe function. So like it just slipped right into use effect. And so
Yeah.
is that detailed enough?
Yeah, for sure. That's actually a good amount of. I think there's a practical takeaway here for people listening who are maybe authoring libraries or just authoring software every day, which is nailing the level of coupling, right? Because this
Yes.
mistake you talk about, where it was exclusive to React, is not unique to you. For example, React query is now tan stack query because it's framework agnostic.
Yep.
Yeah, do you have any advice maybe for how people can do that, or is it just just think about it from the beginning?
Yeah, in my experience uh, of using React since the very beginning, if you can get your state out of React, you're better off.
Okay,
Like it was that's what Redux did, and it was better. That's what Final Form did, and it was better. That's what TanStack is doing, and it's better. That's what XState does, and it's better. Uh,
right.
just I can't explain why
Yeah.
useState is and useReducer is just so bad, but it.
Well,
I don't know.
I think if I can offer, I think there's a conflation here about state, right? And I think this may be the problem. It's just semantics because what is state? Everything is state. Like your
Sure,
database is just a big state container. Your assignment to a variable or ref is
every
state. Like
variable is a
state,
state. Yeah,
right? Exactly. And I think that's maybe the problem because React and the language around use state implies that all state must be in the React render cycle, even if it doesn't require like making efficient updates to the UI. I think that's probably where it comes from, right? Is that accurate? Because not like you said, not everything needs to be in use state, especially if it doesn't require React to know about it and schedule updates accordingly.
exactly. It's you can often put stuff in React state that isn't needed for another
Yeah.
render.
Yeah,
Sure.
good. That I think is a practical for everyone building with React. Stop putting your state everywhere. I think that's super valuable to add. You mentioned you keep coming back to validation as part of your first Redux form and then final form. I think that's probably the most common issue with building forms. I can think of others, like for example, select components not being stylable, drop downs not having filters. Like if you have a select and you have a bunch of options, like the filter behavior is not there. Although you can maybe do that with a combo box. In any case, there may be listeners who are listening to this and going, okay, cool, you built a form library, but what do you solve outside of validation? And how does that then compare to, browsers just have validation built in? Like input elements have required as an attribute and have pattern where you can like match against regular expressions. And I've heard people go like, I don't even need a library because that's enough. So I'm curious if we could maybe speak to the full feature set in addition to validation of what this library offers and why it like rose to fame so well. So well that you ended up giving like a closing keynote at a conference in India.
True. So it's the ergonomics of forms is complicated. Like when forms were first introduced into HTML, you would hit submit and it would send all your form state to the server, and
Yeah.
then the server would have to do the validation and maybe send you back some errors and some sort of, it would probably just re-render the page with the errors in the right place in the HTML. That was the good old days. But it's the faster you can tell a user that something is wrong in the form, the better. We've all had that experience of uh, booking flights is the worst example, where you go down and you hit okay, go, and then it pops up to the very top. It says there's an
Yeah.
error somewhere in this
Yeah.
page. Go find the error. Good luck.
Yeah.
And so you got to scroll down and find it. And so the sooner you can give the feedback, the better. And that's something that requires something working on the client side, because you can't. I suppose you could be like WebSocketing crap to the server, but no. The
Right.
uh, so you and yes, HTML5 does have the validation stuff sort of built in, but it renders differently in every browser. It's not. For sure, it's more accessible. I think they get accessibility right because your screen readers are going to understand that because it's just part of the spec. But you're maybe you want the error. Maybe when there's an error, you want a little helpful note to pop up to be like, no, this is why you need to do this, or
Right.
just extra UI that can help the user fill out the form. And obviously, the goal of anyone writing a form is to get the user to actually finish it and submit it, right?
Yes.
Because if they give up halfway through, then you've lost any of that data that they've been
Yeah.
trying to give you. So, and it's also very possible to do excessive validation. We've all heard stories of someone with a weird character in their name that the airline is like, we don't.
Yeah. We don't serve your kind.
Yeah, exactly. So, or really, really long names or really short names. So, so validation needs to be validation is a big part of it. But then there's other. Let's see. The other thing about what I did with Final Form is I made it. Another complaint that I got was the bundle size was way too big for Redux Form because
Well, and that goes back to the browser, the HTML5 spec. There is no bundle size
right, exactly.
Like, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, what is the cost benefit analysis here? Because like you have zero bundle size built in, but you can't include like nice error messages. So like, you know what I'm saying? So is it worth? I guess what I'm trying to ask on behalf of like skeptical listeners who solve
Sure.
coding problems with like one line of a very complicated regex or something, like what is the big benefit? Validation, absolutely, but that's supported, right? So maybe sorry, I'm thinking out loud here. Maybe it's also the render cycle, managing that efficiently, because as you mentioned, on every keystroke, if you're not careful, you could really shoot yourself in the foot.
That is true if you're using controlled components in React, which,
Yeah.
There's pros and cons there. When I was building my form libraries, it was just taken as React dogma that all inputs must be
Yes.
controlled, and
Yes. That
the
changed
the,
recently.
the flow, the one-way data flow, etc.
Yeah.
So yes, you could, and maybe you should start off with trying to do everything without a form library.
Yes.
But requirements quickly grow,
Yeah.
and like what I was about to say is with the bundle size is that this is a good takeaway for people doing open source. Is I made the mistake with Redux Form of whenever I got a feature request, I said yes, 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 yes. I'll make it do that. I'll make it do that. I'll make it do that. Oh, you needed to do this? Sure, I'll make it do that. And my bundle size got enormous. And so with Final Form, I made a concerted effort to make it modular. So if you don't need the bit that manages arrays of fields, you don't install that bit. But if you do, then you can install this other package and plug it in, and now it handles arrays. Things like that. There's another one actually for converting your validation to HTML5 validation UI.
Yeah.
So that sort of thing. And then the other times you have you need to do something with that form data as the person's filling out the form. The most common example is like, oh, you're signing up for my social network and you pick your screen name, and before you even finish the form, we go and check if that's actually available or if we need to tell you to renew that. And that has to go all the way to the database, obviously. So there's stuff like that, and sometimes you need to like do a calculation based on some value that's been given, and for that you can't just use the platform.
Yeah. That's so good. Thank you for that. Yeah. So I think it for those listening, it's probably helpful to understand your requirements. Like, are your requirements met by just the platform? And if not, then reach for a form library, ideally Final Form. Awesome. Thank you for that. I heard another takeaway that I think is super valuable for people in open source, building literally anything. So we already established, like, the first takeaway is watch your coupling for the reasons you mentioned, right? This was like too coupled with React. What I just heard was another takeaway, which is it has to be modular. And I love, because I see this also extremely commonly. For example, Lodash was this thing where just like threw the kitchen sink of
Yep.
utilities at you, right? But now it's like you can actually tree shake and import just your function. If you want group by, you just import group by from Lodash/group by. And it's modular so you don't conflate your bundle size. That is so cool. Can you maybe talk a little bit about tree? I feel like tree shaking is misunderstood. So can we talk about tree shaking and how we accidentally de-opt from that is to de-opt? We accidentally have bigger bundle sizes because we don't import things appropriately, and we don't allow our bundlers to tree shake.
I'm honestly not really an expert on that. I just I Google how best to do that whenever
Nice.
whenever it's time, and
Yeah.
I know that if you package, there's different ways, all these different incantations of setting up your package JSON in your open source to make that possible or not. But I honestly have not followed all the modularize debate.
We should maybe get like a Tobias Coppers or some type of bundler author on the show to explain that to us. And maybe
Please do.
there's an open source tool that will detect, haha, you're de-opting here and like fail your build or something. I'm sure that exists, but
It must exist, and if it doesn't, a listener should build it.
make it decoupled and make it modular. Awesome. Okay, so I understand now the value of especially something like Final Form, because this, you made a really strong case with the asynchronous like request on the username to check it, and that's definitely a use case I think that I would benefit from using that. Cool. So we've identified two takeaways. You mentioned when you were talking about form libraries, you mentioned something really interesting. You said there was it was too coupled, it wasn't modular, and you said people came to you and said, hey, why is my thing rendering so much? And this is what you had to handle. Why is my thing rendering so much?
Yep.
I want to combine that with a talk that I saw of yours recently at React Alicante, right? You're talking about Solid.js. And Solid.js is like notoriously famous for not re-rendering all the time because of its novel, maybe not novel, but because of its different approach to state management. I'm curious if you could just talk about all of that, and then what that means for like Final Form and Solid.
First of all, amazing segue. So I am not a Solid expert, but I saw enough chatter around it that I went to go check it out. And when I just sort of walked through the tutorial, I didn't even like code anything. I was just reading. And at some point, this light bulb went off, and I was like, "Oh, wait a minute! That's a totally different way to think about state." And then I set it aside for a while, but my brain kept for like weeks later. I was like, "Damn, that's actually really clever that you could couple your state to your DOM like that."
What is that? What is that strange different way?
Yeah. So with React, the genius of React when it came out, and I remember at the time everyone was upset about having HTML in my JavaScript.
Yeah.
People did not like JSX.
The good old days.
But yeah, can you imagine now? But the crazy thing about React was they were like, oh, we have this virtual DOM where the DOM is super slow, but every time you change anything, we're going to re-render the whole application. And that blew everyone's mind. Like, you can't do that. But they were like, yeah, we do it like to this virtual DOM, and then we diff, and we only update, and it's super clever, and it's fast enough. And it actually was fast enough for literally almost everything. You can build a React application and get really, really deep in a huge application before you really need to worry about re-rendering. But there are these edge cases where that becomes a problem, where stuff just keeps, it just gets slow. Like, I had people say, when I add my 300th input, it starts to lag when I'm typing. And I was like, okay, dude, good luck with that. No, but with Solid, they they flip it on its head, where rather than re-rendering the components every time anything changes, it registers which bit of the DOM depends on which bit of state. And in that way, it can track when you change that bit of state, it just renders that bit of the DOM. So it's not generating this whole virtual DOM and doing this complicated diff. It just knows, hey, when this state changes, go back and rerun this little bit of rendering code here. And that makes it so fast because it just with every change it goes and just surgically updates that one little bit of the DOM that needs to change, and nothing else has to change. And that I think is super clever. And yeah, it just sort of blew my mind. And especially as I said in my talk, the fact that the component renders once to a React developer, that's like what how
yeah.
But that is how.
I find that so interesting because I feel like when I got into React 10 years ago, that was the value proposition. You know, I mean, the logo is an atom. Like, and so I expected like atomic, like just update what changed. And I remember like it was 3 years into building production React. I was like, wait
that's
a
just
second.
because of radioactivity, I think.
Oh, interesting.
Reactor,
Oh,
nuclear reactor.
That's okay.
I think that's the atom.
Wow. I thought it was because it's small and you could. This is something we'll need to get the core team to confirm or deny. That is so cool. I didn't even think about it that way.
Look, I mean, I haven't written a book on React, but maybe you could find someone that has.
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice? So I was so disappointed when I realized, oh, these updates are not as granular as I thought. And then they added to the dev tools like, you know, why did this re-render? And you would get these like borders around things that re-rendered. And this is the moment I recognized the need for a form library many years ago. This was like 2017, because I would type keystrokes and I expected the input element alone to re-render. Turns out the state container re-rendered, not the entire application, but the state container, which in my case was pretty high up in the tree, and so all the children. And I was like, what? Because like that's what they taught us with React, right? In 2013, it was lift state up. Then when you lift state up, then everything that's under it re-renders. And for me, this was like, oh my goodness, my application is much slower than it could be. And so I don't know. I feel. And maybe this is controversial, I don't know, but I feel a bit cheated that I thought that it was granular updates when it really wasn't.
Well, it's granular DOM updates.
Right.
When you say re-render, you're re-rendering to the virtual DOM, and in theory, the reconciler is then only changing the DOM bit.
Yeah.
So, like the DOM is the slowest part of everything.
Yeah.
So
that's so rendering.
It's not entirely a lie.
Yeah. That's a good way. I feel more comforted because rendering isn't even expensive as far as I know. That algorithm is very optimized from what I know anyway. However, Solid.js like doesn't need that. Wow, what a concept!
Yeah, and like who knows what the next big wow moment will be in UI design.
Yeah.
But it sure feels like, I mean, and the fact that all the other frameworks are adopting signals, it seems like that's a good direction to go in.
Yeah.
And obviously React can never really adopt signals.
Is there a Final Form adapter for Solid.js?
There's a proof of concept that I wrote because I was just like, hey, I've got this Final Form, framework agnostic form library that I bet it'll work in Solid. And if you Google Solid Final Form, you'll find my blog post about it, which maybe you can link.
Yeah.
But it's just and it's really cool that Solid has these what are they called? They're like use directives or something.
Yeah.
It brought back some bad Angular taste in my mouth from Angular 1, but you can put this decorator on an input, and the way I wrote it in this 100 line proof of concept is you just put use colon field in your on your input, and that will call this field function that will then register that input with Final Form as an input and track updates to it.
That's so
and
cool.
It'll have all the validation work and everything.
Nice.
And because all you really need to connect an input to Final Form is you need to be able to be given a value, and you make that the value of the input, and an on change.
Right.
And optionally, if you want, you can pass on blur and on focus, because that provides other functionality.
Yeah.
But you really just need the value in the on change to make a controlled input. And if you give me a DOM instance of an input, I can connect that up, and it just works. Like in the blog post, I said, this is cool. Anyone wants to run with this, go for it. But I don't think I'm going to. But I might change my mind.
Why are you not going to? Is it too much work?
It's a lot of work, and and just to maintain open source is
good. That's
young man's game.
That's a way to help people get in the door of open source as well. I'm sure there's a number of Solid.js enthusiasts who would like to learn the intricacies of forms and also Solid.js, and so open invitation is what I'm hearing for people to join the effort.
Yeah, there must already be some sort of solid focused form library, but if someone wanted to build one of those and they didn't want to have to think about all the intricacies of form validation and resetting and submission and async validation is a really difficult part of forms.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to build one of those, then there's already this like core engine that has 100% test coverage that you can just grab that and attach it to your components.
Wow, 100% test coverage. That's actually, fun fact, I'm rebuilding my website at the time of recording, and I've decided to use Solid.js for the interactive parts. The whole site is Astro. I think Astro should be the de facto standard for building anything on the web today. Maybe a discussion for another time. But I'm using Solid.js islands to make it interactive, and forms in Solid are hard. They're way harder than I expected. Compared to React. Because with React, you could do a controlled input or you could do an uncontrolled input. Either way, you have useState and you bind things, or you don't bind things. But you do bind the value of the input somehow using refs or similar. In Solid, I really, really, really struggled with two-way binding of inputs and having inputs be controlled. It was very strange. And I still don't know the solution. So
interesting.
Yeah, really. So like I had an input with I bound the value to a signal, which is Solid's primitive for reactivity, and I had a on change, and I just had set input, set value on e.target.value. So this worked. It looked like it was bound. However, in some other closure function somewhere, I called the same set value, and the input's value never changed. And I was like, why? This is so weird. So even though I bound it to the signal, when the signal changed, the input's value didn't change. And I still don't know why. As far as I know, I'm not doing any weird stuff that would opt me out of reactivity. I'm not destructuring. I know that's a no-no. For some reason, my input's value never changed until I decided I'm not going to bind the input to a signal, but instead I'm going to just take the ref to the HTML element and just set its value, like imperatively. And that just works. It works performantly. It's great. Now it's currently my website's in like family and friends testing to make sure it doesn't like break. But wild. This was one way Solid really, unfortunately, unpleasantly surprised me. Have you had a similar experience? And also, I'm thinking now maybe I should just use Solid Final Form for this. And if the POC isn't enough, just finish it.
By all means, go take that and run. That's interesting. Like I said, I'm not really a Solid developer. I have done maybe 2 input form with Solid, and I did not run into that. But then I wasn't trying to change it from elsewhere. And you reminded me another thing that I learned when I was learning Solid was that on change is not really an event.
It's on input,
That's
right?
like a React thing.
Yeah.
And all these things that we've, as React developers, we just think is part of the platform, like class name.
Yeah.
It's like, nope, that's not HTML. I thought that was funny.
Yeah.
Interesting.
What was your, if you don't mind sharing, if you're not bound by NDA or something, you mentioned you created Redux Form to solve your problem. And you mentioned your problem was, the problems that Redux Form solves. But I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more about this use case that had you going like, I wish I could fix this. I'm going to create a library. As opposed to making a function in your code base and just calling it a day. Like, what was the decision point from going, I'm going to fix this in my code, to I'm going to make this a library? And was it just like, we talked about earlier, like I just want to be validated and make something cool? Was there more to it?
That is a good question. My use case was a side project where it was basically like a enter your CV, like a LinkedIn sort of a thing, where there were like 15 different fields, and you could, some of them were drop downs, some of them were text, and some of them were text area. And I just wanted to like save 15 fields worth of data.
That's it. And React on its own was
in React. And in React, the docs, even to this day, they tell you how to make one controlled input,
Yeah.
and then say good luck. And if you've ever, gotten up to 6 or 7 use states in your form component, and then if you're really doing it, you probably also need like use states for your validation errors and et cetera, or you end up with an object of your states. But even then, you're still, it still is complicated. Yeah. Why did I open source it? That's interesting. At the time, and one of the reasons for my success in the Redux Form game was, at the time, just for, it was part of this side project, but I was maintaining this. Remember back when you wanted to get started on a React application, and you went and you downloaded this template of like, here's a way to build a React application.
Is that, do you mean create React app or?
Well, way before that. Okay. And I had one, this was like Webpack had just come out, and I managed to piece together this Frankenstein of a thing that had, it had server-side rendering. It was isomorphic. That was the big word. And it was, so you would, you would render on the server, and the way it would render on the server is it would render and keep track of any promises that had been fired off to like fetch data, and it would like wait for those to resolve. Wow. And then render again, and then wait for any new ones. It would just like render like 15 times on the server and then spit it out to you, which is probably not how Next.js works.
Probably.
But probably. And so I had built up to this sort of this best practices thing, and I got a lot of people really liked it. It's still my most starred repo on GitHub. Oh, wow. It's got like 11,000 stars or something. And people, I've stopped looking, but people used to keep starring it like 7 years after it had been updated last. And one of the things I did was I threw my form library on there as an example of how to do. It was doing Redux, and of course server-side Redux too. It was complicated. And so I included my form library as, hey, this is how you do forms. And I think a lot of people copied that repo to build their application, and it already came with a form library built in, and they just sort of ran with that. I was talking to someone on Twitter last year, and they said that they still, with their startup, they still use their website is still that basic setup for that repo. Wow. But I'll send you a link to that.
Yeah.
Not that it's good for anything, but other than
historical reflection. Yeah.
About historical, yes.
Yeah.
So because I was maintaining that, and I was getting some feedback through people were like fixing things because they were using it and they were fixing things.
Right.
You know, the beautiful, virtuous open source cycle. And because that was going on, and I was using it to build my little application, I decided to open source Redux Form, and it wasn't a conscious, hey, let's see how many people I can get to use this.
Yeah.
It was just like, hey, I've solved a problem. Like
Yeah.
the ideal open source thing is, hey, this is a problem that's probably common.
Yeah.
Here's one way to solve it.
Yeah.
Take it or leave it.
Yeah.
So
And hey, I asked the question because I know there's a big distinction between, and this is something I'm facing right now, like building my new website. I'm solving a lot of novel cases that are absolutely fun to solve, particularly in the AI space. Like my website has AI as a first class citizen. It's absolutely fun, but lots of foot guns and very easy to. I think one thing that can go wrong is run into a $10,000 bill in the span of a day if you're not careful. You can do this because AI is expensive. So thinking about like caching and what's the best way, it's fun, right? But now I'm solving these things, and I feel like I could make a lot of this stuff into open source libraries. However, I'm deterred by and this will sound really bad. I apologize. I'm deterred by the enormous amount of effort it would take to like package it up nicely. I'd have to like go through my code and make sure it's like understandable and readable. I have to write a README. I need to think about maybe a project name and a logo and like
docs. Yep.
Do I want to do a docs? Exactly, docs. Oh my gosh. So do I want to do all that? You know, and you seem to have decided it's worth it. I'm curious, like for those listening, how do you arrive at that? Is it just gut feel? Do you regret it? Do you, after all the maintenance burden where people come to you and they're like, oh, we'll support my case and support my case? And I've heard that burnout is so common among maintainers because of the demands of free software and people using it. So this is where I'm at. I can open source a bunch of things, including, I will go on record and say this, my entire like conference speaking thing is run autonomously by an AI agent. I actually don't. Anyway, so I want to open source that. But I'm like, but like docs, and is it worth it, right? And so yeah, what would you say?
If something goes wrong, yeah. So I enjoyed that. Open source has a lot of intrinsic motivation of it feels good to solve problems for someone else.
Yeah.
And when someone comes to you and says, hey, I really want to use your thing, but I'm running into this problem, you know, and you can go and quickly solve a thing, or you see that this problem is going to be a common thing that lots of people are going to run into, and you can solve it. And then they come back to you like, oh my God, thank you so much. You've saved our team, 100 hours of work, thank you so much.
Did they say thank you with money?
No.
I mean, if you
say thank you with words.
If you save 100 hours of work, then in theory, that 100 hours is your compensation. Anyway, I'm just being coy.
Yeah, no. And so that, all you get for open source labor is that warm, fuzzy feeling. I had this conversation with another one of your guests, Artem.
Yeah.
The other day, and because he's spending many hours in the open source land, and he feels the same thing. Of it just feels good, and it's like they're novel problems. Like you say, what you're enjoying about your journey on building your website. These are new problems, and the reason we are engineers is because it's fun to solve problems.
That's right.
Right. So that you get that own, that is nice in and of itself. Yeah. And would I do it again today? I mean, probably not. I've sort of stepped away from open source.
Yeah.
Because also when I was doing all that open source work, I had a day job that, let's just say, was not that taxing. And well, not only wasn't it that taxing, but it wasn't that interesting. I wasn't scratching that itch on the clock. So I was like, hey, there's this new framework. Let's see what we can do with it. And that was really rewarding. But I'm doing more interesting things at my day job, and the pull of open source is not quite as strong.
Are you
But
sorry.
it is fun.
No, I was just going to ask. You mentioned more interesting things at your day job. So when I think of you, the author of Final Form and Redux Form, my mental image is at your day job. You're sitting there and you're just like optimizing the heck out of forms. But of course, that's not true. That's just the library you're famous for. I'm curious if you could speak to what interesting things happen at work.
I uh, I've never had a job where my library was used in the code base.
What?
Isn't that crazy?
That is very strange.
When the first job after having some open source fame that I had was at a company where they had built their own in-house way of keeping form state in Redux. And I was like, okay, cool. Uh, and I've had a couple jobs since, and none of them have used my library. Uh, no, my day job is just front end GraphQL, React
Okay.
stuff.
And it seems to be hitting the right spots in terms of mental stimulation.
Yes.
Great. Great. You gave a talk at Reactathon in 2022 that I was there for, and it piqued my interest because it was sort of, I don't want to say novel because it had been done before, but it was definitely like uncommon, put it that way. And the talk was about XState and using XState, and I think Stately as well, podcast sponsor, using them on the server side. And this is really interesting because you went from form state on the client side to modeling and then like filling in business logic and using a state management library that I think came up around React on the server side. I don't know that there's many people doing this. I'm curious if you could maybe summarize that talk, the use case, and why XState on the server side.
Yeah. So when I gave that talk, I was using XState extensively every day at my job, building just nested machines, just this glorious symphony of
State charts.
state machines, state charts. And let's see, there was one use case at that job where I was building it was a webhook. I was like listening from something from like linear and taking that data and doing something on the back end, but it required, hey, here's a call from this webhook. I need to go fetch a couple other things, do this, and then update something, and then I'm done. And yes, you could do that with some async await stuff, but I was so in that moment used to thinking visually.
Yeah.
Like once you go really into state charts and XState and visually mapping out what your program is doing, it's really kind of a mind shift. Not dissimilar to like going to signals from React.
Right.
It's just like, oh, this is a different way to think. And so I had built this backend webhook to using XState, and it just occurred to me that, oh, this could be like a next big thing of using state charts on the back end, because why not?
Yeah.
And if it works well to manage your logic in one environment, why not in another?
Yeah.
And so I came up with that talk as a lot of the best talks are the ones that are like imagining the future. Like this is the way we might be doing things in the future. And a lot of those don'ts are just sort of smoke and mirrors, hand waving. But for that one, I actually built a way to run that. And the tricky bit was, well, there's two tricky bits. One is serializing your state machine so that you can have state over multiple requests.
I'm sorry to interrupt you here. Can you, for those listening and maybe haven't been exposed to state machines and state charts, just like summarize like a little bit of like what is a state machine? Is it an actual physical machine? Do you put in a card and get out something? Like, yeah, maybe we can start there and then distinguish between that and state charts, and then talk about what the use case was for the backend.
Right. Okay. This is yet another time where the word state becomes confusing.
Exactly.
So with a state machine, it's the way it's designed in XState is just like this JSON definition of different possible states and transitions between the states. So your typical example is like a play pause. Everyone get out the device you're listening to this on and look and press pause and then press play. Like that. Currently, you're hearing me and your app is in the playing state. But if you press pause, then you're now in the pause state, and you can define a finite set of transitions between the states, between the finite number of states. So it's and it's what you accomplish with this is that you eliminates impossible states.
Right.
So if you're coming from React and you were trying to build this podcast player component, you might have, if you weren't thinking about it very well, you might have like a loading Boolean and a playing Boolean and different things, like different bits of state that are all together.
Yeah.
And so the impossible state there is you can never be loading and playing at the same, or
you can never be paused and playing at the same time.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So state charts help you, state machines help you avoid getting into those states, but they also let you fire off effects when you transition between states. And when you're rendering in a declarative UI, you can just say, hey, what state am I in? Okay, this is what the UI needs to look like. And state charts are a way to visualize this with boxes and arrows. So you're in the playing state, and the transition is an arrow over to the pause state, and then there's a transition back, and you can define that and see it. And it really, like one time I had built this state chart, and I was going over it with a non-technical member of my team. And so this is then we go here, and then we do this. And he said, wait a minute, no, this should actually go over there. And like he found a bug in my state chart.
Wow.
That I hadn't noticed, and it would have been a bug, but he didn't have to know how to code. He was just like, oh, no, we don't go to that state, we go to this other one. So that's sort of the power of state charts.
So you can model every possible permutation of your application, state A, state B, state C, state D, and then draw lines between them and go like, look, you can go from A to B, but not from A to C. You've got this intermediary step, and you can model that. Just a big drawing, and that can help even people who don't know how to code spot potential bugs and like prevent them. And
it's a great way to just start ideating on what your UI needs to look like or to do.
Yeah. And so that case for UI is clear, but I guess I can sort of roughly see the dots connect for the server side. For example, on the server, if you have a webhook, you've got some states. You've got request received, you've got obviously response sent, and you've got some stuff in the middle, right? And so what I understand is you had this like linear style webhook that you just modeled basically the webhook's behavior, and then filled in the logic and shipped it. That may be an oversimplification. I'm wondering if there's more detail there that I missed.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you transition into a state where your you're waiting on an async call.
Yeah.
And then when that call comes back, then you can know that you can transition to the next state, and you know that when you're in that next state, you have that data because you've gone through the path to get there. And what I did in my talk was model like a e-commerce checkout form where we've all gone through thousands of them where you're in the cart and then you click buy, and then you add your shipping information and your billing information and then you go to the order confirmation, and then you say yes and order complete. So those are different pages, but boy, can they be drawn nicely in a state chart with box here and then box to this page. And then if you need to go back, or if you get to the confirmation and you click on the shipping heading, this should take you back to the shipping page. And it should remember that when you hit done, then you go back to the confirmation page, not necessarily through the thing again. So that's a complex flow. And the trick to building it on the server side, and well, the reason to build it on the server side that I demonstrated in that talk is that it can still work without JavaScript in the browser. And because it's all sending stuff to the server.
Right.
And the trick to that is somehow persisting that state machine's state, because HTTP serverless calls are
stateless. I think I hear this server anytime I hear server side state, immediately my security brain goes off, right? Because client side state is bespoke to the client device, meaning you will never have the state in my browser right now because we're separated by physical distance, and not just physical distance, physical machines. Like you're on your device, I'm on my device, and even if we're looking at the same product in a shopping cart, our states are unique because I've got all kinds of cookies and local storage and it's just client state is always unique to the client. Server state can be accessed by any number of clients, and so if you're not careful and if you've got server side state, particularly cached state, and your cache key maybe doesn't factor in some type of user ID, you could, in theory, leak state between user sessions, and your user could end up in someone else's shopping cart, for example. Is that a consideration you've had to deal with working with XState on the server?
I mean, that's true of any website that you log into.
Right. So it's not
every request.
It's not exclusive to XState.
No, yeah, like any useful web app has user server side state, because they know what user you're logged in as, and then they can check what permissions you have to that.
Really?
And if someone spoofs your exact HTTP request, then the server thinks that they are you. So yes, obviously you need to not just cache them as integers and take a request parameter that's the integer of the state machine you want to load. But yeah,
I don't know. I want to push back on that a little bit, and ask the question, because the statement was any server side application knows what user is logged in, what client is logged in, but the way that it knows that is through some header. So it's the client saying, "Hey, this is my token." And without the client sharing its unique state, the server has no idea, normally, right? Or did I misunderstand?
Correct.
Okay.
Right. This HTTP is stateless.
Right. Yeah.
So it has to with every request, it has to look at the headers and figure out who you are, and then it can look into your state machine.
Right. Awesome. Great. Well, I wanted to ask you, just circling back. Sorry, did you have something?
I have one other quick thing.
Yes, for sure.
I know you said they're a sponsor, but the cool thing about Stately is, I said your state machine is just this blob of JSON, and then you can draw these pretty charts. The crazy thing about Stately is that they are bidirectionally linked. So if you change an arrow in your chart, it will change the definition of your state machine. And if you change the definition of your state machine in JSON, it will change the chart too.
Wow.
And that's the real game changer that Stately has brought to the table.
So it makes
shout out
sure
to them.
you're and of course that bidirectional linking from the state machine in your code to the state machine in the visualizer also carries through to your application, I have to assume. So when you like import the state machine,
Yes.
obviously that JSON schema has changed, and so it's really you start from a drawing, but this drawing makes it through every level of your application.
Exactly.
Wow.
And as anyone that's ever tried to draw anything related to their code knows that as soon as you finish drawing it, it's out of date because the code has changed and no one went back to update the drawing.
Yeah. So
this does that for you.
So it's an evergreen diagram of the flow of logic through your application. That's what I'm hearing.
That's a great tagline. Yes.
That's so cool. Yeah, I work in DevRel. That's awesome. I wanted to ask you about just coming back to Redux form and Redux in general, right? Because part of the motivation of this podcast is to capture a little bit more nuance than what we see on like social media and maybe shorter form content. This is not to disparage, but you can't get the nuance across in like 5 minutes. I've seen a lot of takes that people go like, Redux is dead. Redux is dead. Use MobX. Similarly with GraphQL, right? Someone asked on social media recently on Twitter, is GraphQL even relevant? I'm curious. What's the like from a Redux form perspective? Is that maintained? I'm assuming it is super maintained because Redux is in fact not dead and is useful today. So, what's the state there? State, pun intended.
Yes. I haven't used Redux for a while, and when I was using it, it was still using the old syntax. None of this new
RTK stuff.
Toolkit stuff. Which I hear is amazing, but I haven't used it, so I can't really comment. Redux form, all it is a reducer that you plug into your Redux, and I assume as long as a reducer is still state action gives you back the next state, then it should all still work. Like That's what a reducer is. So,
yeah.
And which is part of the genius of Redux.
Yeah, it's so pluggable. Great. Thank you for that. It seems like you can still use it and use it successfully, but the preferred option is to use Final Form. Another question I had just based on all that you said was Solid.js. You seem to have this appreciation for Solid because of this like wow moment where it's so almost it feels novel even though signals are not, and it is more efficient. You're probably not using Solid.js at work, I don't think. But would you consider, like, if you got the chance to start a greenfield project, would you go for Solid? Would you not? Maybe there's takeaways for listeners making tech choices.
I think I would. I started a small side project that was that I chose to use Solid for, and I actually ran into some complexity there because, like, the thing with any new framework, like I chose to use Solid, and then I was doing well, and then I was like, how do we? I need this very common problem solved, and I went to look for a library to do that, and they were like, yeah, here's React common problem that you could plug in. Oh, you're not using React though. Too bad.
Yeah.
However, the common problem in this case was authentication. I was using Clerk.js, which you're familiar with.
Yes.
And they have a really quick React library you can plug in. However, they're their just vanilla JavaScript API is so good that I was able to write a quick solid, like one of these use directives to make it work, and it just worked because all their vanilla JS thing cares about is give me a DOM element and I'll render the auth thing into it. So you are going to run into cases where, oh, if you're using React, there's this built-in thing that already solves your problem, but on you're not, because it's just not a mature enough ecosystem.
Yeah.
And it's also not. It's not like from what I recall and what I've read since I used it, one of the strengths of Angular is that it's so there's a way of doing everything, and it's not this free for all ecosystem of libraries that React turned into.
Yeah.
And that I don't really have opinions about Angular other than the first one was very difficult. But choosing the non-ubiquitous framework is fun.
Yeah.
And it's educational. But if you want to ship something tomorrow, then
Yeah.
it might be too early.
This is really great. I love how you captured the trade-offs there, because there's a lot of people. So I was at a conference in January where somebody said to me, and I didn't know how to respond to it. Right? I was at this conference and somebody said, I'm working really hard to be a content creator, and I want to be the next James Q. Quick. And I thought that is so cool. What ambition, you know? Because James is awesome. I absolutely love James. We'll probably get him on the podcast. But there's this ambition, and I've heard similar things of people going like, I want to be the next Kent C. Dodds. I want to be a great developer educator. And we're living in this stage where these people have built such great reputations that people aspire to be them. And I think about tying it back to Solid, like the ecosystem seems to be young enough that people can get involved and solve real problems, and be that they could teach things that nobody else is teaching. They could build ecosystem components that nobody else is building. I don't want.
Exactly.
Yeah, this is sort of how you got your sort of start speaking at conferences, right? You just built a form library in a very young ecosystem. So we're sort of seeing a resurgence of that.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. If you want traction for your open source library, don't build it for React.
Yeah.
Because there already is one for that.
Yeah.
For whatever you're trying to do, there probably already is one.
Yeah, and there's probably already 10.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Which is super handy if all you're trying to do is ship a React application. But if you're trying to have fun and make a name for yourself in the open source community, then I would not choose React. I would choose one of the newer frameworks.
Yeah. This is so cool because like I met the other day the maintainer of a component library. I think it was Cobalt in Solid, which is as far, I'm probably getting this wrong, is Shad CN UI, but in Solid. So a lot of people are doing this. They're like, okay, this thing exists in React. Let's just port it over and build the ecosystem. And building the ecosystem then builds traction for the project, and the whole web benefits because Solid is faster than React, and so its adoption story increases.
Correct. Exactly.
Can we? I'd like to start wrapping up. I would love it if we wrap up with sort of lessons you learned. So you already talked about like making things modular and decoupling, but you've maintained a very large project. I don't know exactly how many downloads and users, but I imagine it's a lot, especially if like you're getting randomly mentioned on Twitter and being invited to conferences. So we have 2 lessons. I'm curious, off the top of your head, does anything stand out where you're like, oh, I made a mistake and I learned, or I just learned, or somebody from the community told me and I had no idea, with the depth of your open source work?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned before, it was a mistake to always say yes to, hey, can it do this?
Yeah.
I mean, in engineering, the answer is always probably, but there are trade-offs.
Yeah.
And if you're, and I got so accustomed to the thrill of the challenge of, hey, can you make it do this?
Oh, you for sure I can. That was a response, right? Just
Yeah.
watch me hold my beer.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think you have to, I mean, just like with everything in life, you have to learn when to say yes and when to say no. And like with all of life, when you're starting out, you need to say yes to everything, and then pick and choose when to say no. Like jobs and dating and everything. Like you gotta once you have enough of your of your time spent filled up, then you need to start saying no. And and like, I guess in engineering we call that, maintaining your scope or scope creep or whatever.
Yeah.
Like just because your button library could, make the button bounce all around the screen when you click it, like,
Yeah.
doesn't need to.
Yeah.
So there's that. And yes, modularity is good because every weird edge feature that is requested of you is maybe not everyone's going to need that.
Yeah.
So if you can build it in a way that optionally you could provide a thing where, yeah, if you needed to do this, then plug in this other thing. Like,
Yeah.
in Final Form, I had a very open, I think they're actually called plugins, where you could just provide some code, it would provide a function, and it would give you all of the form state, and you could do whatever you wanted to it and give it back.
Wow.
And so that solved so many weird use cases of, hey, I needed to do this. I need to multiply all these values by 3 every time you click this button or whatever.
Yeah.
And it would be like, all right, go implement that with a single function. Modularity and
Scope creep.
maintaining your scope and patience and good. The more responsive you can be to requests, the better your users are going to feel, and they're going to tell more people about your library or whatever. And so
awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I was talking to Artem about exactly this in an episode that shipped earlier. And he mentioned exactly the same thing. As an open source maintainer of MSW, mock service worker, he was spot on. He was like, I have to say no sometimes. But, and he shared this, and you can go watch the episode if you want, or listen to it. He said, it's important to say no, but it's also important how to say no. He said, you don't want to be a jerk about it. Be like, no, I'm not doing your thing. Goodbye. But what he often does is, this isn't the right fit here. I know this is the author, but I'm sure there's a way we can make it work. And I think this is similar to what you were saying. Like, this is probably going to add bloat to my thing, but maybe we can make a separate module that people can import when they need. So it's not a no full stop. It's a no but, or maybe a no and. And I think that can definitely help, right? Has that been your experience? Or I'm not asking you if you've been a jerk and just been like, no, full stop. But I want to be sensitive to the fact that this can also potentially lead to overcommitting. Like in my case, I tend to do that, no but, and then my no turns into a yes anyway, So
right,
yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. Only, I don't think I've ever really said no, go away.
Oh wow, what a saint!
I have not said that. Exactly. Although there was one guy that was trying to build like a spreadsheet sort of thing using forms.
Oh my gosh!
And it was just like,
that's a spreadsheet. That's hundreds of inputs, like a Google Sheets thing with Final Form.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh!
That sort of thing. And yeah, so yeah, you need to, if you need to be aware of how useful the request is for everybody, and if it's a really specific thing. And again, it's code. We're just passing functions around. You can probably provide some escape hatch, like I was just saying, to just be like, yeah, throw a function in here, and we'll give you total control to totally mess everything up however you want, and then you give it back.
Yeah.
And if you've broken it, then that's on you. But at least you had a way to go do whatever it was you wanted to do.
Yeah.
So
awesome. Escape hatches. Well, listen, Erik, I really appreciate you giving up a significant portion of your morning to come chat with me about Final Form, Redux Form, Solid.js, and X. We covered a lot of topics, and I just want to pause here and just appreciate you for coming on the podcast and sharing your insights. I definitely feel more empowered to model the application flow of my applications with something like XState across client and server. My eyes are maybe wider open to the complexities of form and validation and async state specifically. I was completely blind to that, and also Solid. And I think the cool thing is there's also tips for like growing your presence in the open source stuff by filling in the ecosystems of young projects. So all that is my long-winded way of saying, on behalf of me and all the listeners, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me. Anytime.
Thank you for joining my discussion with Erik Rasmussen. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I hope you learned what it takes to build and maintain an open source project in a healthy way, and also about React Final Form and Redux Form. Additionally, I hope you understand Solid.js in greater depth and also the application of state machines on the server. The whole goal is that we indeed eliminate some of your imposter syndrome and together celebrate the beauty of engineering. If you're learning from and or enjoying this content, and if you're watching on YouTube, I'd invite you to subscribe to the channel and like it. It's a really great zero-cost way to support the podcast. If you're listening on Apple and or Spotify, then I'd invite you to leave up to a 5-star review. This also is a huge help for the podcast and really a no-effort way to support it, if you believe in the mission, of course. If you found any of this useful, I'd also invite you to share this on social media. For now, thank you so much for joining the discussion. Thank you for being a part of this podcast, and most importantly, thank you for your interest in web engineering.